All right, here we go, rascals. Moving along to chapter 15.1 and 15.2, which covers pages 481 to 499 in your textbook. We're going to be looking at what I call rising tensions. No, that is not a picture of me. He's got too much hair to be me. That is John Brown, who you're going to learn about at the end of this presentation. Let's get after it. Here are our learning objectives for today. You will be able to explain how disagreements over slavery led to increased tension and violence in the United States in the mid-1800s. So yeah, that is a depiction of a famous episode in the Capitol from this time period. That is a member of the House of Representatives almost beating a United States senator to death while others look on. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes here, but all right, so let's do a little bit of review right now. We're going to go back to the Colonial Times, way back before we were actually called the United States. The economies of the North and South had been developing differently. So in the North, you would find many small farms, and over time, factories and commerce became more and more important to the North. It became a manufacturing center for the country. The South's economy all this time relied on plantation farming, which depended heavily on slave labor rather than industry. And these economic differences will begin to divide the nation in really dangerous ways during the 1800s. All right, so slavery and territorial expansion. This is going to be a little bit of a review right now, too, but this is important to help us have context for what we're going to really talk about today. So remember, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was supposed to have settled the issue of slavery and the expansion of the United States. So for those of you who are struggling to remember, that's okay. It's late in the school year, but I'm going to do a little bit of review on this. So this state right here is Missouri. I'm circling it right here. I've done this many times before. I'm going to do it again. This is where you get really great baseball right here in St. Louis. Go Cardinals. Missouri was admitted to the United States, as a slave state. That gives it this red color right here. And at the same time, Maine, which you can't see, but you know where Maine is. It's off of the northeast corner of the country. That was admitted as a free state. And the Missouri Compromise also said that slavery would not be allowed north of the southern border of Missouri. That is this green line right here. So the idea of adding Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state was to preserve this delicate balance between free and slave states in this country, particularly in terms of the representation in the Senate. All right, so fallout from the Mexican-American War. So we talked about the Mexican-American War last week. There's a famous writer in American history named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he kind of hit the nail on the head when he said that the Mexican-American War will poison us. Mexico will poison us is actually what he said. So this yellow area over here in the southwest corner of the United States was called the Mexican Cession. Those are the lands that we took from Mexico after we were victorious. The United States was victorious in that war. Okay, so how is that going to poison us? Well, it's going to reopen the discussion of what can be a slave state and what cannot be a slave state, or how do we allow slavery to expand, or how do we prevent it from expanding. So the North wanted no more slave states. They were done. The abolitionist movement is starting to really pick up steam in the North. The South, they wanted these lands acquired from Mexico to be open for slavery. So we see where this dispute is going to be. It's going to be centered in this area over here. All right, so why would it even be a problem if slavery expanded into the territories taken from Mexico? Well, remember when we talked about the Missouri Compromise of 1820, we used that word balance. Okay? The North felt that if those territories allowed slavery, then the balance that was achieved by Missouri Compromise would be lost. Boom, all of a sudden we have more slave states than we have free states. So the slave states have weighed the scale right here, and we are out of balance. That's not going to be good for us, according to the North. All right. A Pennsylvania representative proposed a bill in Congress that would forbid, which means to not allow, slavery in the territories that were gained from Mexico. This is called the Wilmot Proviso. And it never became a law, but it was one of the things that deepened the sectional divide between North and South. The North has their own interests, the South has theirs, and oftentimes these interests of these two sections of the country clash with each other. It's going to cause a lot of conflict and a lot of bloodshed here in the next 15 years or so of this story. So California, we talked about the gold rush last week. They apply for admission to the Union as a free state. This would upset the balance in the Senate, so the South was against it. What the South wanted to do here to keep that balance is they wanted the northern part of California to be a free state and the southern part to be a slave state. That was their solution to this. Well, we've talked about the Missouri Compromise. We're going to talk about the Compromise in 1850. This is also handled by our old good friend, the great compromiser Henry Clay, who is just about ready to die at this point in the story, but this is his last great attempt at smoothing out these sectional differences. So, what are the good parts of the Compromise of 1850 for the North? Well, California, the entire state of California, not just the North, California itself becomes a free state. And the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is abolished. No more slave trade in the nation's capital, although it is a southern city, as you know. So what's good for the South about the Compromise of 1850? Well, Congress is no longer able to pass any laws regarding slavery in the remaining territories, meaning the Mexican cession, the areas that we got from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. And Congress would pass a stronger law to help slave owners. We're going to look at the Fugitive Slave Act right now. So this was a law that required everyone in the North to assist Southerners in tracking down escaped slaves. We talked about the Underground Railroad before. So say, for example, a slave escapes, I'm going to pick on Georgia. They make it via the Underground Railroad all the way up into the North, say they're in Pennsylvania or something like that. This law required people in the North, even if they hated slavery and they were abolitionists, to assist Southerners in tracking down escaped slaves. This angered many people in the North, and it's not difficult to understand why. The Fugitive Slave Act also had the effect of making or convincing more people in the North to join the abolitionist movement. There was a woman, a writer named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she publishes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. This is a very, very important and consequential book in American history. This book depicted the cruelty and immorality of slavery. Northern readers liked the book. The book angered the South. You see another division along sectional lines, disagreements between North and South. And Southerners felt like it didn't give an accurate picture of the realities of slavery. The Southerners a lot of times tried to cover up the savagery of slavery by saying, oh, it was good. We gave African Americans, the slaves, we gave them civilization and religion, and they were pretty happy to be there, all of which is not true, of course. All right. So here we got the big V word in here, violence. We're going to start seeing escalating or increasing violence in the country around this time. So in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act divides Nebraska Territory, which was all this area that I'm circling right here, into two parts, Kansas and Nebraska. We see Nebraska up here, which also has the Dakotas and I think part of Montana in it, and Kansas is down here. So the idea was that they would use popular sovereignty to determine if these were going to be admitted as territories that allowed slavery or territories that banned slavery. Popular sovereignty means people vote for their preference. So this leads to something called Bleeding Kansas. So you had pro-slavery people, a lot of them coming from Missouri, which was a slave state, entering Kansas to decide to vote whether or not they would allow slavery. And there is really robust and widespread anti-slavery feelings in Kansas too. And these two factions, the pro-slavery faction and the anti-slavery faction, clashed in Kansas for years. Some people call this the first bloodshed of the Civil War. Many people died during these years of violence in the Kansas Territory over the issue of slavery. So Bleeding Sumner. This is another incident of violence. This was from the first slide of this presentation. So violence even broke out in the Senate too. So Senator Charles Sumner, this is Charles Sumner on the ground right here, he's from Massachusetts, spoke out against pro-slavery forces in Canada. And he was beaten almost to death by Preston Brooks, that's this guy, who is a congressman from South Carolina. And it looks kind of funny, you see this guy smiling in the background, but it really, really wasn't. Charles Sumner was permanently disabled by this. He was almost killed. That's a heavy wooden cane that the guy bashes him about it. There were other members of Congress that sat around and watched this happen. It was really, this is crazy to think. You think that people in Congress right now don't get along very well, and there's a lot of divisions along party lines, but there's nothing like this happening now. All right, the Republican Party forms. The issue of slavery continued to divide America. Even political parties were divided by the issue. The Republican Party formed in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. I wonder if you knew that the Republican Party formed in this state. It was an anti-slavery party, and it was a sectional Party, which means that it sought to protect the interests of the North. There was not really any Republicans. I mean, I'm sure there were a few of them in the South because there are people who were opposed to slavery in the South, but this was a sectional party, meaning its platform, its issues that it supported, and its initiatives that it supported all supported the interests of the North. So the election of 1856, the Republican Party nominates John C. Fremont for president. He's known as the Pathfinder. Since the Republican Party was a sectional party, not a national party, because it was only interested in policies that favored the North, Fremont's name wasn't even put on the ballot in the South. So there's no chance of him being elected. So in 1856, James Buchanan wins the presidency. Buchanan becomes the president after the election of 1856. He was liked by voters in the South who agreed with his support for states' rights and limiting the power of federal government. And he's often regarded as one of, if not the worst presidents ever. Poor James Buchanan. Here's a little trivia for you. He's the only president we've ever had in this country out of 45 presidents who never married in his life. He was from Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, I think. All right. So we're going to get to a breaking point in this rising tension and this increasing and escalating violence between these two sections of the country. I'm going to put these slides in Google Classroom. I want you to watch this 3-minute video on the Dred Scott case. It's linked right here. Go in and watch that. That video will give you, let me go back. That video will give you background into this case, but I'm going to talk about what the Supreme Court said and how they ruled and made their decision in this case. So this guy over here on the left, that guy's name is Roger Taney. You'll hear in that video they call him Taney. It's spelled like Taney, but it's actually pronounced Taney. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time, and we try to use context when we analyze history and know that people have changed over 150 years. But if you want to, after watching that video, if you feel like booing this guy, Roger Taney, you can boo him. I'm going to tell you right now, he made a horrible decision here. This is probably the most infamous and regrettable and disgusting decision the Supreme Court ever made. He is a bad guy. For the last 150 years, he will continue to be a bad guy. Don't feel bad for him. The Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott 7-2, so it wasn't even a close decision. So Chief Justice Taney reasoned in his decision that since Dred Scott was an African American, he was not a citizen of the United States, and therefore he didn't even have the right to sue anybody in a court of law. Taney then went further by declaring that Congress had no constitutional authority to ban slavery in the territories, and this also implied the same thing regarding states, meaning that there was an implication, or they hinted at without actually coming out and saying it, that Congress had no constitutional authority to ban slavery in any of the states because that meant that you were restricting somebody's property rights because they viewed slaves as property, not as human beings. So this is why that ruling is important. So it overturns the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was put into effect to preserve a balance between slave and free states. And it essentially means that slavery was allowed anywhere because making a free state would mean that slave owners' property rights were not recognized. Well, how would you think people in the North or abolitionists would feel about this? This is probably what their facial expressions looked like at the time. They were really, really angered by this. This is definitely a really, really dark moment in American history. Taney is forever reviled or hated for this decision. Well, with all this escalating tension and violence, we do have one ray of sunshine. For the first time in our story, after 9 months of school, our man comes into focus right here. That is Abraham Lincoln without the beard. So Republicans, that new political party, they believe that Democrats wanted to legalize slavery in all territories and states. And they nominated Abraham Lincoln to run for the United States Senate from Illinois. And he loses to Stephen A. Douglas, the man responsible for that Kansas-Nebraska Act that suggested that popular sovereignty should determine whether or not states allowed slaves. Lincoln loses that election, but he does become a national figure. Don't worry about that. We're talking about 1858 right here. He'll be back 2 years later to run for the presidency of the United States. Last thing we want to talk about today, John Brown and Harper's Ferry. So on the first slide of this presentation, you saw this picture. This is a man named John Brown, who is very, very famous in history for one night in 1859. John Brown was an abolitionist who had taken part in the violence at Bleeding, Kansas. So he actually, during the violence in Kansas in the 1850s, he actually had murdered pro-slavery Kansans using a sword back in 1856. That's crazy to even think.